Today's daf, we're going to be learning a Sanhedrin daf mem aleph. We're going to start from the very bottom of mem amabet amar ula. So what we're trying to figure out here is where is the source for warning in the Torah? What does it mean, warning? Hatra'ah? Well, before anyone does a sin, if they weren't warned before, and we already learned they have to not only be warned, but they have to say, I heard your warning, and I don't care. I'm willing to die for this. Then we can't war. I'm willing to get lashes for this, whatever it might be. We cannot actually give them a punishment. Okay, it's a bit of a crazy thing to think about because what are the chances are that warn, before they are warned for this, right? Before they do this action, someone's going to be there to warn them, right? So it's a bit of a hard concept to get over, and we're going to see there's possibly some exceptions to this rule. And as we already learned, eidim zomemim are an exception to the rule, but otherwise, basically, before you do any sort of action, you need this warning. Otherwise, you won't be punished. What is the source for that in the Torah? So 3 lines from the bottom of Mem Amud Amar Ula, Minayin lahatra'ah min Torah. How do we get that you have to do this? Where do we learn in the Torah? We're going to end up with 4 different sources, and then the Gemara is going to say, what do we need all these 4 sources for? First source, Shenemal, the Isha asher yikach et achoto bat aviv o bat imo. Okay, someone who engages in relations with his sister, right, whether father or mother, through the father or the mother, v'ra'a et ervata, and he saw her erva. Now, saw her erva. Atu be'ri'iyah talia melta. Does that have to do with him seeing? It has nothing to do with seeing. He could engage in relations with her without seeing. What does that have anything to do with it? What it means is until he sees and understands the ramifications of what he's doing. And how is that? Right? That's by warning. Now, what's the problem here? Well, the pasuk is talking about, the pasuk there says, you will get the punishment of karet. Okay, they will be wiped out. Now, karet is a God-imposed punishment. Obviously, you don't need to be warned for God-imposed punishment because God gives punishments. God knows what you're thinking. God knows what, first of all, one of the reasons they say you need to be warned is besides that we need to know you did it right. The main reason, really, they say is lavchim ben shogeg lemezi. We want to know that you were really intentional about it because you only get punished if you were intentional. If it was accidental, for a lot of sins, you bring a sacrifice. But how will we know that if we don't know what's going on in your head? So only if we warn you and and we know that you said, I don't care, then that turns it into mezid. So what do we have here? Well, it can't be for karet. You need to be warned because God knows and God will punish however God wants to punish. The whole issue of warning has to do with a court, a man or a woman, right? Well, in this case, there is no woman held court, but a court of dayanim. So Taneu inyan lamalkot. It must be for lashes. What does lashes have anything to do with it? Well, we're going to get to Masechet Kritut, and we'll learn that for everything where there's chiyuv of karet in the Torah, the rabbis can institute, or for many of them, the rabbis give the court can give you lashes for it. So therefore, this must be relating to lashes. And therefore, if you're going to get lashes in the Torah, by something you did by Torah law, we're going to have to warn you before. Second source. Someone goes intentionally to kill his friend in secret or surreptitiously, right? That was me'imiz b'chi tikhenu lamut, take him from the mizbeach to kill him. So what do you see? Someone did something b'mezid. Now, she trubo vadayin hu mezid. How do you know the person was mezid? So there's 2 ways to darshan this pasuk. Either because it says b'chi yazid, the person is mezid. How do we know? How does the court know whether the person did it intentionally or not? And that's what I said. One of the reasons for the whole issue of warnings in the first place, to be able to distinguish between whether the person did it intentionally or not. How else would we know? Nobody knows what's going on in the thoughts in someone else's mind. Or some people say it's because it says v'chi yazid. Now yazid is present tense, and we're going to see it with the next source as well. Present tense means they continue to be mezid, meaning there was some point where they intended to do something, and then you warn them, and then they continued to do it while they were still intentionally wanting to do it, and that would explain it. So that's a different way of explaining this drasha. Third source, Debei Rabbi Yishmael Tana. In the house of Rabbi Yishmael, they had a braita that said, Notice these are all based on Torah verses. That was our whole question. From where in the Torah do we get this? This is in the desert when they saw there was somebody chopping trees. Now, again, it says mikoshesh. Mikoshesh means now presently chopping trees, not they saw someone who was chopping trees, right? You would have thought if you were writing that pasuk, you would say, oh, and then with these people who found him chopping, right, that he chopped trees. I mean, you could say it both ways, but what they say is they warned him and he continued to do it. There has to be some sort of present that it spanned a period of time. Besides, before they found him, then when they found him and they warned him, he continued to do it. Tibei Rebbe Tana, right from the house of Rebbe, said, Al davar asher ina. Now we're on the Nara Murasa, which is a betrothed woman. We've talked about her many times. A betrothed woman engages in relations with someone else, right, while she's betrothed. So both them, if she does it willingly and not raped, which we'll get to all that later on in the Masechet, what does it say? They both get skila, they both get stoned, which, by the way, is the same punishment. We didn't talk about it, but the punishment of the first one was clearly lashes. The second one was a death penalty of saif, that's hereg. Okay, it's by the sword. The third one was Shabbat, which is skila, stoning, and this one also is skila, stoning. Okay, so now they say al davar sherina aliskei dibur. Why does it say al davar sherina? On the fact that he tortured her. So, or however you explain that pasuk, which we'll get to another time. But the point is, davar is aliskei dibur. There must have been some sort of speech going on there. What kind of speech? If not, a warning. That's the least convincing answer, I would say, but another source. So now the Gemara wants to know tzricha. Why do we need all four of these cases? Well, you need them all. By the way, you don't necessarily have to say that these all four were together, right? Notice we had different people brought different sources. Could be, this one read that source that way, this one read that source a different way, and there were four different approaches here because each time it was a different Beit Midrash they quoted who said that. The first was Ula, and then the next were three different Batei Midrash that quoted Braitot that they had traditions about. But you could just say these were different traditions. But the Gemara often likes to take this holistic approach that they all exist together. In which case, what do we need them all for? If it had said just the first case, Havamina, you would have said, if you're liable for lashes, you would need to be warned to get them. But But maybe for the more severe punishment, again, we talked about this logic yesterday, that if you did something worse, not really the more severe punishment, but the more severe transgression, you'll be punished even without warning. Because what? We're going to let people murder and let them get away with it just because nobody warned them? So therefore, you might have thought maybe you don't need to be warned there. Maybe, and also you could say, everybody knows murder is forbidden. Of course, so you would say everyone knows it's forbidden to sleep with your sister. So, okay. So anyway, so therefore we need the second one. So even in the death penalty. So let's say you had the malkot and you had the saif case, the case where you get killed by the sword. Havamina hanimile saif, to kill. You would have said that only includes saif, which is of the lesser. Remember, we talked about two categories, a bit of a machloket within each category, but definitely skila and streifa are higher level, and hereg and chenek are the lower level. So that would be saif, which is more light. But maybe if you did something like Shabbat or Nara Murasa, you would get the punishment skila even without being warned because that's so severe. Therefore, tzricha. Okay, so you might have thought, Emalo, you don't need it. No, you need it there too, and that's why you needed the skila cases as well. Now, we still have two more questions, which is number one, why two cases of skila? Why not one? And number two, why not just give the skila case, and from there you could learn about all the other cases? Because if the whole theory is even to get the severe punishment, you're going to need to be warned. Then obviously for the less severe punishments, you would also need warning. We don't need a pasuk for them. So those are the two questions we have left here. So now the Gemara is going to say, "V'tarte b'niskalim lamali." Why do we need both in niskalim? So the Rabbi Shimon, la'tuye nisrafim, according to Rabbi Shimon, which we learned yesterday, who thinks that streifa is more strict than skila. So now we have two by niskalim, one to teach you about skila, and one to teach you in the classic imeno inyan. If it's not meant for skila, well, then we'll use it for streifa. That begs the obvious question, which is, well, then why didn't they put the pasuk in streifa, right? But the obvious answer to that is, it's not really. The rabbis didn't really think the Torah put it there for this reason. The rabbis are using this as a way to get to their drasha, right? It's always the question, which came first, the drasha or the halakha, right? They know it's the halakha. They're trying to find sources of the Torah Again, not necessarily the Torah wrote it this way for that purpose, but this does leave open a room for interpretation. So since there is no verse by Sreifa, so we have to just say, okay, one of the skilas we're going to move over to Sreifa. The second answer is going to be, so now that only works according to Rabbi Shimon. According to the rabbis, Sreifa is lighter. So if Sreifa is less severe than Skila, then you don't need a special pasuk to teach it. So why is the pasuk there? And same answer we gave yesterday, Le Rabbanan, Milti ba'ati b'kavachomer, tarach v'katav lakra. Sometimes, even though you could have learned it from a kavachomer, the pasuk just writes it for you anyway. Okay? Even though you could have derived it from a logical inference, but Torah sometimes bothers to write it anyway. Okay, now our second question. So why don't we just write it by skila and then learn everything from there? So same answer. You really could have learned it b'kavachomer, but the Torah wanted to tell you anyway. And that explains our four sources, why there's a need for all four. Moving on to the next section. One thing we learned about Hatra'ah, we're going to still stay within the realm of Hatra'ah for a little while. The Mishnah had said you have to also hitir atzmo l'mitah. It's not enough that the witnesses say we warned the person, but the person has to say, yes, I hear your warning, and even has to add, al minat ken ani oseh. And I don't care, I'm doing it anyway. Okay? Meaning, I'm willing to die for this. It's so important to me to do what I'm doing that I'm willing to get the death penalty if need be. Minalan, how do we know that the person has to basically, hitir atzmo l'mitah means say I'm willing to die? Amarav v'item chizkiah amakra yumat hamet. Okay, what's the whole pasuk or the beginning of the pasuk? It's al pishnayim eidim o shlosha eidim yumat hamet. Right, and lo yumat al pi echad. Now, what does it say in this pasuk? So first of all, we're going to come back to this later. By 2 or 3 witnesses, now I'm going to translate this literally. The deceased will be killed. What do you mean the deceased will be killed? Someone who's alive will be killed. You don't kill someone who's already deceased. So what do we understand from Yumat HaMeit? The fact that they call this person a mate, Ad Shiatir Atzmo L'Mita, until the person, it has to be the person already calls themselves a dead person. I'm willing to die. And that's why they're called a mate already. Okay, now we're going to have a halacha of Rav Chanan, who right now it doesn't look connected, but we're going to connect it to the issue of warning. Amar Rav Chanan, Eidei Na'ara Murasa Shuhu Zamu, Ein Heragim. If 2 witnesses lied, okay, they said we were there at a certain time, at a certain day, and we saw this Na'ara Murasa, this betrothed woman sleep with another man, which the punishment is skila for both of them. And then eidim zomemim eidim mizimim come and say, but we were with you on that day somewhere else, and you couldn't have possibly seen that, and they become eidim zomemim. What's the punishment? What did they try to do to them? They tried to get them killed, right? Because they got the death penalty. But Rav Chanan comes up with this radical halacha and says they don't get killed. Why not? Because they could say, oh, we weren't trying to get her killed when we testified about her. Well, there's 2 ramifications to an Na'ara Murasa who sleeps with another man. Number 1, she gets killed. But let's say we can't punish her for whatever reason. If we can't punish her, the death penalty, she still can't get married to her husband because we have a general rule that any woman who sleeps with another man while she's married or betrothed is forbidden, number 1, to her husband and forbidden to the person she engaged in relations with. So they could claim we weren't coming to get her killed. We were only coming to forbid her to her husband. Okay, so that so far doesn't have to do with our topic. But now the Gemara is going to connect it. Because the Gemara is going to say, what do you mean? But didn't they warn her? Now you have to remember, they didn't warn her. They faked the whole witness. Okay, they lied. The whole testimony is a fake. But when they come to court and try to convict her, did they not have to say, we warned her that if she does this, she will get the death penalty? Which means that obviously they were trying to kill her because that matches their warning. Their warning was, you'll get killed. And therefore their testimony would be obvious that they were trying to get her killed. And if they didn't warn her, then it's obvious they were only coming to forbid her on the husband. So, because that you don't need warning for, that's not a punishment. I mean, it is a punishment, but it's really more like a ramification of your action. So, but it doesn't require hatra'ah. So it shouldn't be that any case of nara murasa, if there are eidim zomemim, they don't get the death penalty because they can always claim we were only trying to do this, and as if they have believability that that's all they were trying to do, they could claim that. Isn't it based on whether they warned her or they didn't warn her? Again, it's not whether they really warned her, it's about what they said in court, because the action never happened. Right? We're assuming they're lying. But when they lied, did they say they warned her? They didn't warn her, right? So if they warned her and if they said in court, we warned her that she will get the death penalty, then they can't say we only came to forbid her to her husband. So the Gemara says, Dilo atruba. So maybe it's a case where they didn't warn her, and that's why they can say we only did it lo sral ba'ala. To which the Gemara says, no, there's a weird assumption here, because what Rav Chanan is basically saying is, even what his chiddush is, even though she could have gotten killed, they don't get killed. Okay? Now, how could she have gotten killed without warning? Okay, so now we're saying, right, the only way she could have gotten killed was if they warned, right? And if they warned her, or again, they claimed they warned her, if they claimed they warned her, then they should get the death penalty also. So something doesn't jive here. So they say, yeah, to lo atruba. They didn't warn her. So ilo atruba hechi mekatla. So if they didn't warn her, then how could she have gotten the death penalty? To which they answer, B'isha chavera ba'aliva de Rabbi Yosi b'Rabbi Yehuda. Wait. She must have been in isha chavera, which means she was a woman who kept mitzvot. You have to wonder if she was in isha chavera, what was she doing sleeping with some other man while she was betrothed? But let's put that question aside. But she must have been in the group of people that were not amei haaretz, right? Even chaverim sometimes sin. So she was in the group of people, not the amei haaretz, but the chaverim. And this statement of Rav Chanan must go according to Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehuda. What does Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehuda say? Detanya, Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, we've learned this before. Chaver ein sarich hatra. The whole laws of warning is not true for an entire population of people. Which people? Chaverim. People who know halacha. People who know halacha don't need warnings, because what's the purpose of the warning? The whole purpose of the warning is to know. Did the person know what they were doing was wrong, or did they not know? Now, who needs to know that? Only people who don't know the law. Obviously, if you're an aram or asa who learned halacha, okay, here you see women even knew all the halachot. If you were an aram or asa who learned the halacha, you know you're going to get the death penalty. You don't need someone to warn you. Okay, and this, by the way, makes the whole thing seem a lot easier, right? The whole thing, concept, someone's going to have to warn you. Well, now we only say it's for people who don't really keep mitzvot so much and might not know the halacha. So they have to be warned because it's not fair to punish them if they don't know. But people who know, right? Because again, we don't know. Maybe they did it not knowing. Shogeg. And shogeg, you don't get killed for shogeg. You only get killed for mazit. So now they say, okay, so wait. So the situation is she could have gotten killed. They can't get killed because they could claim we were only trying to forbid her to the husband. And there's no proof that they weren't, because they didn't say we warned her that she's going to get the death penalty, because she didn't need warning. And that's why she could have gotten killed and they don't. But wait a minute. If they can't get killed, then how could she get killed? Because it's testimony that can't be, you can't have hazamat for it. Okay, where do we learn this? In the Chakirot. If you don't answer what day of the week it was, or what time of day, or what month, or all those things in one of those questions, well, then no one can knock you out. And it has to be testimony that you could be knocked out for, that you could become eidim zomemim. The definition of testimony is it has to be testimony that there's a potential for someone to turn you into an eid zomem. Now we're going to take that even farther. It also means that it's a testimony that you could get the punishment kasher zamam. So she can't get killed if the eidim can't get killed for doing it, right? It can't be that the eidim would get a lesser punishment when she would get a more severe punishment. We can't punish her by that severe punishment if they couldn't get that punishment. So basically, they say hachi kamar. You're right. So this is what they said. What Rav Chanan was really saying, because he never said that Aram or Asa was killed. The Gemara just assumed that she's killed and the witnesses don't get killed. To which the Gemara says, fine. Since they don't get killed, if they're eidim zomemim, because they could have said, we were only trying to forbid her to her husband, we weren't trying to get her killed. So also this Naram or Asa, who's a chavera, right, and therefore didn't need warning, and they didn't warn her. Again, they didn't warn her because nothing happened, but they didn't say that they warned her. Well, she doesn't get killed either. Because if she were to get killed, it would become testimony that couldn't come to the fruition of eidim zomemim. Okay, now, so basically what we've said is like this. It's a little bit confusing because there's two cases we're talking about. One is where the witnesses come and they were telling the truth about this isha chavera, and they said, right, she slept with this man, but they didn't say we warned her, okay, that she will get the death penalty. In the case that they're not eidim zomemim, she actually doesn't get killed. Because if they were eidim zomemim, they wouldn't get killed because they can always claim, don't kill us. We were only trying to forbid it to her husband. And therefore, she also will be forbidden to her husband if convicted for this crime, but she won't get the death penalty. Okay, that's what we got into now. So now the Gemara says, wait. So all ishot chaverot, like isha chavera, every woman who knows halacha and doesn't get warned is never going to get killed. That seems crazy. Ela isha chavera de kaimalan de mikala liba de Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehuda yechim mishkachalaf. We're going like Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehuda that an isha chavera doesn't need warning. So how would you ever have a case that she gets killed? And we just can't imagine what. There's no case where she would get killed. So they say here we have some cases. Kishazinta v'chazra v'zinta. What if this was her second time committing a crime like this? Okay, you have to again wonder what. She was really a chavera. She did this twice, but okay. Now, if she did it twice, she's already forbidden to her husband from the first time. So they can't claim we were doing it to forbid you to her husband, which again means that if they were telling the truth, she could get the death penalty. But wait, if each time she engaged in relations with a different man, the eidim could claim we were trying to forbid you to the second person you have relations with. Because remember, she's forbidden to her husband. That already was done from the first time. But she's also forbidden to the person she engages in relations with. So now we're going to have, right, the witnesses could say we were just trying to forbid you to the second person. So that case doesn't work. They say, well, it is a case, zinta v'chazra v'zinta, but either the first person was zinta miboel rishon, the first case where she had relations with person A, and then again have relations with person A a second time. So already she was forbidden to her husband, and she was already forbidden to person A, and therefore the witnesses can't claim that's what we were trying to do. The only thing the witnesses could have been trying to do was to kill her, and therefore the witnesses will get killed if they were zomemim, and she will get killed if they're not zomemim. Or if the first time she engaged in relations with one of her relatives, then already she was forbidden to her relatives. She was anyway forbidden to the relatives from before. And I guess the second time, you would have to say, right, the second time she was with relatives. So she was already the first time forbidden to her husband. Doesn't matter who she engaged in relations with. And if now she was with one of the relatives, you can't say we were trying to forbid you with the relative because she was already forbidden by the Torah from the relative. And then again, the only ramification for the testimony could be that they were trying to get her killed. So with that, we finish that section. Wait, sorry. There's one more last question. Why did they give a case of a nara murasa? It would be true for a married woman, right? Why take a betrothed woman case? The same thing would be for a married woman, all these cases, because again, we're just trying to forbid her to her husband. Yeah, you could say that as well. It would be the same. So why did they specifically use a case of nara murasa? Because even in a case where she hasn't ever engaged in relations with her husband, so we're going to assume we would have thought maybe they can't say we're trying to forbid you to her husband. She was never permitted to her husband to forbid her. But no, they could still say we're trying to forbid her down the road for when she gets married. We don't want her to get married to this guy. And they could say that's what we were trying to do. And again, that would explain. Okay, so this was all a tangent we got off because of the issue of hatra'ah and this comment of Rav Chanan, and it all of a sudden begged the question, well, the warning doesn't make any sense here, right? Must be she wasn't warned, and then we had to explain it only according to Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehuda, who held that Esha chavera doesn't need warning, and therefore it must be talking about an Esha chavera. Okay, moving on. Now we're back to bedikot and chakirot. Amar Rav Chisda. Remember, chakirot are the 7 main things, or possibly there's a few more, but 7 main questions about time and place. Then we have bedikot, which seem to be less significant, right? And bedikot are basically what color what clothes were they were wearing and all that. And Rav Chisda says, if one said he killed him with a sword, and the other said he killed him with some sort of axe. Ein ze nachon. That's not true. Now, what does nachon mean? Why are we using the word nachon? Why don't we say it's disqualified? Well, nachon was the word in the Torah. Remember, hinei emet nachon adavar, and you found it to be true, okay, true and accurate. So that means this isn't accurate testimony because there's a contradiction in something very basic, okay? Even though this is the time and the place, but this is the basic implements used for the murder. That's very critical. It shows that the witnesses really didn't see the same action. One said the clothes he was wearing was black, and one said the clothes he was wearing was white. Okay, whether I think it doesn't really matter if it's the murderer or the one who was murdered, right? But they have a discrepancy there. That's accepted testimony. On that, we're going to have four questions from four Tannaitic sources. Meitive. Nachon, this is a quote from the Pasuk, nachon adavar, right? You check the witnesses and it seems to be true. Sheyehei nachon, it has to be very accurate. So what's accurate and what's really they're going to say what's not accurate. Echad omer b'sayif harago, echad omer bariran harago. So far that's just like Rav Chisda. One says that the weapon was this, one says the weapon was that. Doesn't work. Echad omer kelav shchorim, echad omer kelav levanim, ein ze nachon. But here it says if they disagree about the clothing, it's not accepted either. That goes directly against Rav Chisda. So Tirgumar Rav Chisda, how could he explain this? Besudar shachan kubo, dahainu sayif ariran. In this case, okay, not Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda was talking about the color of the clothes, but the clothes they're talking about here could be like a scarf that they used to strangle the person, and it could have been the implement used. And the question is, what color was it? And that you have to know what color it was. Okay, so we just say that even though the line looks exactly the same, each one is talking about something else. Second source, and the first three are going to be explained in this way. Tashma, chadumer sandalav shchorim, chadumer sandalav levanim, ein ze nachon if they disagree over the color of his sandals. Hatamnami kigoncha ba'atbo b'sandalova harago. Again, you could say the sandal was, he kicked him with the sandal and killed him with the sandal. And if that's the case, right, then it becomes again the weapon that was used for the murder. Source number three. Tashma, Maseu Badak Ben Zakai B'uktzei Te'ena. This was our Mishnah. Ben Zakai checked, he asked questions about the stem of the fig tree. Okay, now that's not a weapon or anything. Amarami Barchama Kigoncha Akatz Te'ena B'Shabbat. De'ala Kamiktel. Maybe it's a case where the person picked a fig on Shabbat, and that's what we're killing the person for, specifically for picking a fig. And therefore, if you're looking at the person picking the fig on Shabbat, for which they're getting killed, then you have to say, what kind of stem was it? How was it attached to the tree? That would be something you should have noticed. V'had Tanya, but wait, isn't there a bright? We're going to see a bunch of different versions of this story. Besides, in our Mishnah, it appears in several other sources. Amrulo tachat te'ena harago. They said the person was killed under the fig tree. And then Ben Zakkai insisted that they say what the stem looked like. So you can't say it was Shabbat. And it was the major implement. It clearly wasn't. Well, now they're going to say, yes, maybe you could say, Ela Amarami Barchama Kegoncha Shipdo Biyichul Shel Te'ena. You took the stem of the fig, like the branch there, and the guy stabbed him with it. And it was the implement. And then we answered just like we answered the previous two. Fourth source, and this one's going to be answered differently. Tashma Amar Lahen Te'ena Zo Uktzea Dakin Uktzea Gasin Te'enim Shchorot Te'enim Levanot. Okay, here we say, that Ben Zakkai said to the witnesses, what color were they? What was the stem? What the stem was it thick? Was it thin? Was it black? Were the figs black or white? This doesn't sound like right. You can't kill someone with figs. I don't think by pelting them with figs you could really kill them. So it's hard to say that that's the issue. To which El Amar Rav Yosef, mi Ben Zakkai lo tibinish. Wait, you're questioning Rav Chisda from Ben Zakkai? Shani Ben Zakkai de b'diko kichakirat mashavile. This is clearly bedikot. It's just Ben Zakkai had this very strict approach that he thought the bedikot were like hakirot, but nobody else holds that way. So don't question Rav Chisda from Ben Zakkai. He was extreme. Okay, moving on, but not really moving on because now we want to understand who is Ben Zakkai, right? Now, if I asked you who Ben Zakkai was, what would you tell me? Who's the most famous Ben Zakkai? Rabban Yochanan Ben Zakkai. But the Gemara is going to raise two issues with it: one chronological and one a linguistic issue. Man Ben Zakkai. Who is this Ben Zakkai? Ilema Rabban Yochanan Ben Zakkai, who's very famous. Mihava b'Sanhedrin. Was he in the Sanhedrin, in a Sanhedrin that could kill? Because Tanya, it says in a Braita, Kol shnotav Rabban Yochanan Ben Zakkai 120 shana. Now we're going to learn about his life. He lived 120 years. Arba'im shana sak b'farkmatya. The first 40 years he was a businessman. Arba'im shana lamad. Then he learned for 40 years. Arba'im shana limed. And the last 40 years of his life, he taught. And taught means he was a dayan in the court. So he was only a judge in the court for the last 40 years of his life. Vitanya, and another Braita says, 40 shana kodem churban habayit galta Sanhedrin v'yashvala bechanut. The Sanhedrin left already the Lishkat Gazit in the temple 40 years before the destruction of the temple and moved to the Chanut. Chanut could be a name of a place. Rashi says it's a place in Jerusalem. Most people think it's on the Temple Mount, and many people say it was the stores in the Temple Mount, because Chanut is a store. And it moved to one of the stores in the Temple Mount. There were all these stores because they would buy all sorts of things for the sacrifices. So that's where it moved to. Now, Amar of Yitzchak bar Avdimi, Lomal, what did this teach you? Shalodanu dine knasot. They didn't anymore teach dine knasot, fines. To which the Gemara says, dine knasot, what do you mean? Just because they moved out of the temple doesn't mean they didn't do dine knasot. Ela shalodanu dine nefashot. From those last 40 years, they didn't judge any capital cases. There's even sources that say that they specifically left the Lishkat Gazit because they didn't want to judge capital cases. Some people say they had to move. It's a big debate why exactly they moved. I'm going to leave that point aside, but it's very interesting from a historical perspective. Anyway, okay, so let's keep going. We haven't yet built our full case. Utnan, it says in the Mishnah, very famous Mishnah, Rabban Yochanan. If you remember, he was famous for instituting all these takanot after the destruction of the temple to remember Zecher l'Chorban, right? To remember Zecher l'Mikdash, what happened in the temple. Ella, so now we have a problem. Because how could it be Ben Zakkai if the last 40 years of his life, he was a Dayan and not before that? And the last 40 years of the Sanhedrin, the last 40 years before the destruction, it wasn't even, they couldn't do Dinei Nefashot. And obviously we're talking about Dinei Nefashot case. We said Tachat Atena Harag. And he lived after the Chorban, then clearly the only time he was a Dayan in the Sanhedrin was within the last 40 years. We don't know how many, but let's say 35 maybe, or whatever it was. So it doesn't make any sense. It couldn't be Ben Zakkai. Ela Ben Zakkai de Alma. Okay, it must be some other Ben Zakkai. And Hachinami Mistabra, another reason why it doesn't make sense was Rabban Yochanan Ben Zakkai, because Yisakatata Rabban Yochanan Ben Zakkai. Karele Rebbe Ben Zakkai. Why would they call him Ben Zakkai? He was Rabban Yochanan Ben Zakkai. He was even a Nasi, which gets him the title Rabban. It would be crazy to call him Ben Zakkai. So for two reasons, they basically say this clearly wasn't him. However, we now have a problem because there was another bright. I told you there's all sorts of bright about this. Ben Zakkai checking the Uktzei Teinim, V'hatanya Maaseu Badak Rabban Yochanan Ben Zakkai Uktzei Teinim, and here he's listed with his complete name, Rabban Yochanan Ben Zakkai. So now we're back to square one. So how can we explain it? Ela Talmidei Yoshev Lifnei Rabbo Hava. It was the earlier 40 years. It was when the Sanhedrin was still doing Dinei Nefashot, and he was a student who suggested this to the rabbis. But Amar Milton was Starbalutama. He said something to the rabbis, and it sounded good to them, turning out I'm a bet. The Kavua Bishmei, and they said it in his name. In other words, they really did the checking. But because he suggested that they should ask that question, it became in his name. It was told in his name. So Kiav Alamed, now they're just going to tell you that when Kiav Alamad, when he was just learning, Ben Zakkai V'Karele, and now it works perfectly with the fact that he was called Ben Zakkai. Kitamida Yoshev Lifnei Rabbo, like a student before his rabbi. Kiav Alimed, once he taught Havakarele Rabban Yochanan Ben Zakkai, then he was worthy of that title. Kikarele Ben Zakkai, so when they call him Ben Zakkai, even though now already he obviously got the title, but al shem demei kara, because this happened earlier, they called him by the earlier name. The Chikarele Rabban Yochanan Ben Zakkai al shem dehashtem. When they called him Rabban Yochanan Ben Zakkai, it was on things that happened later. Like, for example, after the destruction, he was obviously already Rabban Yochanan Ben Zakkai. And that was all just to figure out who was this Ben Zakkai. Maseu badak v'chule, that really isn't relevant, but now ma ben chakiro l'bdikot, and they talk about differences. And then one of the things they said was if somebody says, I don't know, when it comes to chakirot, that doesn't work. When it comes to b'dikot, that's fine. And it said there, not only if one doesn't know, but even if both witnesses don't know. So the Gemara doesn't like that line because the Gemara says, Maya filu shnayim umrim. Why does it have to tell you even if two of them don't know? Pshita, ki amar achad enu yodei edutan kayemet, ki amar betreinani edutan kayemet. If one doesn't know one of the b'dikot questions, we say they can still testify. Obviously, it doesn't make a difference if one didn't know or if both didn't know, right? It shouldn't make any difference, so that line is totally unnecessary. Because of that, we're going to have two different ways of reading this, and both completely change the wording in the Mishnah, okay? You're going to see Rav Sheshet completely changes the wording, and Rav doesn't like it, but he himself also changes the wording, just not, I guess, as much or not with such a critical word. Ki amre, okay, so again, it's obvious if echad amre ein yodei edutan kayemet ki amre betrei nami, right? If two would say it, obviously edutan would be kayemet. So Amar Rav Sheshet Areshakai. Rav Sheshet says, oh, this is not about bedikot. It's actually referring back to when it says two people. It's referring back to chakirot. Now you can't say it according to the pshat because what does it say? If two say we don't know, edutan is kayemet. It stands. Now, obviously, it doesn't stand. Even one says, I don't know, the chakirot don't stand, so he's going to have to change this. And what he says is this: "B'chakirot afilu shnayim omrim yadanu ve'echad omer ein yodea." He brings us to a case. What if there's three witnesses in chakirot? Like what time, what place, all that. Three people come to testify. Two of them know all the details, and one of them says, "I don't know what time it happened." Now you might think, well, we still have two who say everything, so maybe it's okay. Edutan b'tela. No, according to this, the way Rav Sheshet reads the Mishnah is, now he changes the key word. What key word? He changes edutan kayemet, their testimony stands, to their testimony is canceled. And that's what Rava doesn't like, and Rava is going to reject. But what he says is like this: if you have two out of three who know everything, but one says, I don't know what time it happened, or I don't know what place it happened, or one of those important questions, edutan b'tela, the whole testimony is canceled. On what basis does he say this? Kiman ki Rabbi Akiva. We quoted before the pasuk about al pishnayim o shlosha eidim yakum davar. By two or three witnesses is always a big question. Why does it say two or three? If two, then three, obviously. So they say it's to say the three are like two. When three come together as a group, whatever's true for two is true for the three. And that's Rabbi Akiva's position. And that's here. If one doesn't know, even though we have two to establish all the facts, doesn't matter. We throw them all out of court because one of them doesn't know something very basic. Amar Rava. Rava says, how could you possibly say this? It says their edut works. Not that their edut doesn't work. So how could you switch entirely to such a key word? Ella Amar Rava, again, like I said, he's also going to switch words, just not the key word. He's going to have edutan kayemet, but he is going to say it goes back to chakirot, and he's going to say something the opposite of what Rav Sheshet just said, which is hachikamar. Afilu b'chakirot shnayim omrim yadanu ve'echad omer ein yodea. He goes to the exact same case. He said, I disagree with you. I'm going to say the opposite of what you said. If two say we know all the seven questions, but one doesn't know them, edutan kayemet. Kiman delo ke Rabbi Akiva, because I don't hold like Rabbi Akiva. I think as long as you establish it with two witnesses, if one witness doesn't know all the chakirot, that extra third witness, it's like a third wheel. We don't care about that third one, and we can establish the testimony based on the two. And that's how Rava reads that line. So again, we had this line that was problematic, really not because it didn't make sense, but it was problematic because it was so obvious and didn't need to be said. And therefore, each one explains it differently, relating to the same kind of case, but kind of coming to the opposite conclusion. Okay, now we're going to have a story of Rav Kahana, Rav Safra, and Rami Bar Chama. So Rav Kahana and Rav Safra were sitting, Tanu, Sanhedrin, Bei Rabbah. Okay, they were doing the same thing we were doing. They're learning Masachet Sanhedrin. Okay, it didn't exist in the form it exists right now, but they had Mishnayot, they had Braitot, they had discussions of Amoraim before them. They were learning in the Beit Midrash of Rabbah. Pagabahu Rami Bar Chama. Rami Bar Chama meets them. Amar Lahu, he says to them, Maya Maritu Baba Sanhedrin Debei Rabbah. What are they saying these days in the Beit Midrash about Sanhedrin? Amri Le, Umayim Rina Baba Sanhedrin Grey Data. Why are you asking what they're saying in our Beit Midrash? What they're saying in general in Batei Midrash. Umay Kashalach. In other words, they're saying, get to your point. You're not just asking us a question, shooting breeze. What are you learning these days? You obviously have a question and you want to know what they say in the Beit Midrash about. So ask us. Just be straight about it. Amar Lahu, Mehada Katane, and they were right. He did have a question. So he says to them, Mehada Katane ma ben chakirot lebdikot. Okay, so in the Mishnah it said, what's the difference between chakirot and bdikot? Chakirot echad omer eni yodei dutan betela, bdikot echad omer eni yodei afilu shnayim omrim en ani yodim dutan kayemet. Notice he has the gears of our Mishnah, which is, right, without the changes we just implemented, which is if one said, I don't know in chakirot, we knock out the testimony. If one or even two said we don't know in bdikot, we accept it. Afilu, right, michti. Now here comes his question. If both are learned out from the Torah, because remember we said there's v'darashta v'chakarta, right? There's all now we did use those for the seven chakirot, but basically saying it seems clear from the Torah you need both chakirot and b'dikot, and if they're both from the Torah, my shna chakirot, right? The Rashi says is from v'darashta v'chakarta, okay, or nachon she'en nachon, that you need even the basic facts, the less basic facts. So anyway, however he says that he gets it from the Torah, since they're both required by Torah law, why should we distinguish between them? If all is required by Torah law, they should have the same rules. Amrele, they said to him, Hachi hashta, what? That's not a fair comparison. This we learned already. It's testimony that can't be knocked out by eidim. You can't have two people say, we were with you at that time, at that place, if you didn't say what place and what time and what day and all that. So that's why you need the chakirot. But b'dikot, echad omer eini yodei, dutan kayemet. The reason why b'dikot, if one says, I don't know what color the clothes were, we're going to accept it because it's still a dut that someone can knock out just because they don't know what color clothes, they can knock it out by the time, place, and all that. Amar lahu. So then now we're finished with the question, but we're going to have a bit more conversation with them, which is kind of a strange conversation, and it's unclear exactly what this means. But basically, Rami Bar Chama responds to their answer and says, Ihachi amaritu ba tuva amaritu ba. Wow, if you answer me like that, that's a good answer. To which they respond to him, Amrele, mitivuta demar amrina batuva. Because you asked so nicely and you responded so nicely, we're happy to tell you anything you want to know. Minizihute demar, but if you would come in a not nice way, lo amrina bavalochada, we wouldn't tell you even the first one. Okay, in other words, we only answer people who ask in a respectful manner and are appreciative of our answers, and not people who aren't appreciative of our answers. You have to wonder what motivated them to think that. You could see from the beginning of the conversation they were a little suspect. Like, what do you mean? What do you say? Like, get out with it, And then he asked, and then he was straight with them, so they appreciated that. Okay, next section. Now we're going to the days of the month. One person said second day of the month, and one person said the third day of the month. Ad kama, till what point in the month? Remember when we learned the Mishnah, I said, notice it's the beginning of the month, because there most people are likely to make mistakes. So till what day of the month could we go? Just till the second or third, or even later? To which Amar Rabbi Acha bar Chanina, Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, quoted in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Ad rubo shel chodesh, till the majority of the month. We assume once half the month passes, people already know when the Rosh Chodesh was. Amar Rava is going to try to further prove this from the Mishnah. Afana nami tanina. We can learn it from our Mishnah because one said 3 and one said 5, their testimony is canceled. Why? Maybe one knew the last 2 months, and the other one maybe was off by 2 months. And therefore, once you're off by 2 months, you could be off by 2 days, right? And it's possible. So why not? It must be by mid-month, everybody knows. So there's no way you're going to mess up 2 months. Ella, they say no. Lav mishum de beruba. Ella lav mishum de beruba yada. It must be, right? That's his proof. It must be by mid-month, everybody knows, and that's why there's no mistake that could be considered not a mistake of 2 months. There's no margin of error of 2 months, of 2 days. Because 2 days would mean you didn't know 2 months. And that's because it must be by mid-month, everyone knows. To which the Gemara rejects that proof. Not that they reject what he said, but they reject the proof. Lo'olam emelacha beruba nami lo yada o b'shipur yada. B'chad shipur amar detai, b'trei shipur lo amar detai. They used to blow the shofar to let everybody know that it was the new month. So it could be you missed somehow the shofar blowing 1 month, but it's not likely you missed it 2 months, and therefore that's the reason for the Mishnah not having anything to do with this mid-month, by mid-month everybody knows. Again, it doesn't mean he's wrong. It just doesn't mean that Rava, who tried to prove what Rabbi Yochanan said, that his proof is a valid proof. We're going to end now with what we call Kiddush Levana. Now, there's something called the blessing of the new moon, which people do generally on Motzei Shabbat. There's a big machloket when you start saying it, at what point in the month, until what day of the month, and it's based on this and based on all different interpretations of our sugya. We're only going to get started today, but Amar, and what's the reason for Kiddush Levana? It's a really good question. Some people explain that the reason is, and it's a nice idea, so I wanted to leave you with this, which is that the moon, right, the moon waxes and wanes, and it's basically this idea of, the moon kind of looks like it's disappearing and then it comes back. And there's this idea of hope that comes from the new moon, and the blessing is really on this hope. So it's a nice idea, and especially for days like these. Although I will point out that generally women don't say Kiddush Levana. There's a whole question about it. I'm not going to get into that now. Maybe we'll see if we have time. I mean, these are pretty long, so I don't really think so. But you can look it up. It's an interesting topic. Women's place in Kiddush Levana. Okay, so anyway, Amar Rabbi Acha, Amar Rabbi Chanina, Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. We're going to see why we're here. First of all, it's the same people who were quoted as before. Actually, yeah, it's the exact same people who just were quoted before. And you're going to see this Rubo Shel Chodesh. So, Ad Kama Mivrachim Ala Chodesh. It seems like they're asking, till what day do we make a blessing? Meaning, it sounds like you can make it from the beginning of the month until what day? Until it's no longer right? Empty, it's kind of filled up. So the question is, when is that? Vikama, Amar Rabbi Yaakov Reidi, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Ad Shiva, Nahar de Amar Ad Shishas. It's a machloket. Is it 7? Because it's 7, it's already going beyond the half moon. Or is it the full moon at the middle of the month? So that's the debate here. We're going to see that they both agree with Rabbi Yochanan. We're going to get into that tomorrow. What's just interesting is lahalacha. Some people think that the 7th is the starting day and the 16th is the ending day, and that some people only say Kiddush Levanah from the 7th. Some people say it from the 3rd day of the month. Some people say it from the 1st day of the month. There's a whole debate exactly about when this mitzvah is done, and Sephardim and Ashkenazim have different customs about it. So it's just interesting to know. We'll talk about this more tomorrow, but they obviously got to this number 1. It's the same people who said it, and as the previous statement, and also it has to do with the 16th of the month, the Rubo Shel Chodesh, even though it doesn't really have, they're two totally different topics. One is determining the new moon, and one is making a blessing on the moon, which is something entirely different. And it's called, like I said, it's also called Birkat Levana. It's also called Kiddush Levana. The Levana is another word for moon. And with that, we finish for today. So quick review of our daf. We started with 4 sources for warning in the Torah. We got off on a tangent about this eidim aram or asashu's mood don't get, right? They could claim we were only trying to forbid it to the husband. How does that work in with warnings? We resolved that. We got to Rav Chisda, who said this contradiction, right? His statement about bediko can contradict each other. What color clothing seemed to raise a contradiction from 4 other sources, but each time responded that it wasn't a contradiction. Then from that, we got to who is Ben Zakkai, and we said in the end it was Rabban Yochanan Ben Zakkai. Then we talked about that line in the Mishnah about the 2 people who said Yodim, and Yodea. We accept it's an unnecessary line. We had 2 ways to explain it. One got rejected. We then got to Rav Chanan and Rav Safra, who basically were asked this question by Rami Braham about why distinguish B'dikot and Chakirut if both are from the Torah. They answered it's all about what can be potentially knocked out. And then we ended with this, until what date of the month can we assume that one day of discrepancy is just a mistake in Kiddush HaChodesh? And from that, we ended with the Birkat Levana. Wishing everyone a good day and Shishma B'sorot Tovot.